20 years ago, Microsoft launched the Xbox, a machine created to give the West a space for competition in the console market. It was an immediate success too, mostly due to the myriad of features it introduced, most of which become necessities for gaming consoles since then. This includes online multiplayer, downloadable content, having your own dedicated profile, etc. Of course, all of this is just standard now, but back then this was some revolutionary shit. And such a revolutionary piece of hardware just had to be launched alongside a video game of equal revolutionariness, right? Well, it did. To coincide with Xbox's launch came a video game that was so magnificent, so ahead of its time, and just so much fun that even 2 decades later, it's still being celebrated as such. That's right, I'm talking about Shrek the video game. When Halo Combat Evolved first launched all the way back in 2001, it started a revolution in gaming as it was the first game on consoles to have an expansive multiplayer that allowed as many as 16 players in the same match. But not only that, it was the first FPS to really make a splash on consoles. Before Halo, first-person shooters were primarily relegated to PC as the consoles just couldn't handle them. I mean, have you seen the SNES port of Doom? Yeah. There are games like GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, and Turok, but did any of those games have nearly the same amount of impact as Halo did? In a sense, Halo practically spearheaded the console FPS game, and the genre wouldn't be where it is today without it. Another thing that made Halo so important to gaming is the game design mechanics and storytelling. More on the latter later. You know how most FPS games today only allow you to carry 2 guns at once, or has reloading or tactical precision based gunplay? All that basically began with Halo. A majority of gameplay mechanics that have become staples in shooter games can all be traced back to this game, for better or for worse. Having to use only 2 weapons at one time, reloading, commandeering vehicles, precision-based gunplay, all as I mentioned earlier, pretty much everything you could find in a modern multiplayer shooter originated with Halo. Either that or Halo just simply refined them. But I spent almost the entirety of this review so far just babbling on about legacy and shit, and I haven't even discussed how well it's held up after 20 years. And well, has it? To be honest, yeah, it kinda has. Of course, due to its age, there's obviously going to be some pretty big hiccups here and there, which I'll get to eventually. But for the most part, Halo Combat Evolved has been able to stand the test of time and still offers a very enjoyable and immersive experience despite its age. One big thing that has given Halo such a beloved reputation is its enemy design. Not because the enemies are varied and have different wacky powers and all that shit, but because it really feels like I'm squaring off against a legitimate army. Seriously, the enemy AI is so strategic and well formulated, it honestly feels like they were designed by actual soldiers. The analogy I made might have sounded silly there, but goddamn, I am not exaggerating when I say that this game has some of the strongest AI in the history of shooter games. How this is possible in such retro hardware, I have no idea. The way they interact with their environment, the way they intelligently counter and dodge your attacks, the way their factions are so brilliantly composed, and just how overall dynamic they are, I seriously cannot stress enough how revolutionary the enemy AI in this game is. Really, the only other games from this period that could rival Halo in terms of design is Metal Gear Solid 2. Has anyone else noticed all the little details in the AI when you try and pursue some enemies or vice versa? For instance, elites are incredibly cunning foes. They can use their inferior comrades to their advantage by sending swarms of grunts at you, which forces some distance between you and the elite in question, allowing them to get some major damage on you if you're not careful. It's little nuances like this which makes Halo's interactive enemy design hard to match. And the gunplay only makes things even more fun. Many shooter elitists have criticized Halo for standardizing the 2-weapon formula, but Halo is one of those games where this really seems to work for the better. Halo is a game that encourages you to use your resources to their fullest advantage. 2 guns only system incentivizes the player to use their weapons efficiently, so you're not wasting ammunition, which can lead to strategic gameplay. And speaking of strategy, another strong element of Halo's game design is weapon variety. Every weapon in this game has its own specific niches against the different types of enemies. For instance, plasma-based weapons are good for taking down elites and jackal shields. The assault rifle is good for close quarters kind swarms of weaker enemies, and the magnum, surprisingly enough, is the most efficient tool for long-range combat. Despite being limited to only 2 weapons at a time, coming up with different weapon combinations to see which ones work best in certain situations is always a blast. Like, you cannot tell me that using the plasma pistol to disintegrate an elite shield and popping them in the head with a magnum isn't the coolest shit ever. Or using the assault rifle to decimate a swarm of flood infection forms, then switching to the shotgun once a combat form gets too close. Even if your arsenal is slightly restricted in this game, the weapons sandbox is still strong enough to make up for it. Every single weapon has its own use, which is such a shame because down the line, Halo games started to introduce new weapons that are either redundant because there are other weapons in the same game that have the exact same functions but done way better, or they're just plain hot garbage. Combat Evolved, however, is one of the few Halo games where every weapon is useful, except for maybe the Needler. Now on to the level design, another iconic aspect of this franchise. Halo is mostly known for having wide open level design with arenas that are mainly large areas of terrain, allowing the player and their foes to move around freely while also providing them with enough cover. That is mostly present in this first entry. Levels such as the aptly titled Halo, the beginning of the Silent Cartographer, and some of Assault on the Control Room all have wide open immersive battlefields, but sadly, when you're not fighting in these spectacular spacious arenas, you're practically forced to traverse through linear, copy and paste hallways and corridors, and it gets incredibly tedious incredibly quick. In both Assault on the Control Room and 2 Betrayals, a good portion of the levels are spent in these tiny, cramped hallways, and they're constantly being copied and pasted throughout the entire level too. Even more tediously, 2 Betrayals literally has Master Chief backtracking through Assault on the Control Room, so if you somehow enjoyed walking through those repetitive hallways, well then you're gonna have yourself a blast. Boy, backtracking seems to be quite the recurring theme in this channel, huh? Like every game I've talked about has backtracking to some degree. Anyway, I haven't even discussed the library, which is easily the worst offender when it came to this game's shaky level structure. This level really is the epitome of rinse and repeat, because you will be tasked with fighting the same new flood types in these, yep, you guessed it, copy and pasted hallways for almost half a fucking hour. I mean, sure, fighting off huge swarms of flood sounds cool and all, but once you finish off the final horde while waiting for Guilty Spark to open up a door just to repeat the exact same shit again for the 19th time, it really does start to feel tiring. Playing this level is like listening to a broken record on a loop, if the fabric of time had been altered and the same events were focused to repeat themselves every 2 seconds. Playing this level is like staring at a GIF for 3 hours straight. Alright, I'm done with this bit. Now, since this was the first game of the franchise, you'd expect to see some things that really needed some fine-tuning, and things that would eventually receive it. And boy did Combat Evolved have some severely underdeveloped shit in it. Earlier I mentioned that Halo is one of the first shooters to implement vehicular combat, and boy oh boy did this need some extra time in the oven. Not only did they feel light as a goddamn feather, and feel like you're driving on oil despite being on the grass, but the vehicles are actually kinda useless from a combat perspective. The Warthog has an absurd amount of bullet spread, the Scorpion has horseshit accuracy. Seriously, you gotta be right on the fucking money with this thing, or else no damage for you. And weirdest of all, you actually feel pretty damn vulnerable in a vehicle. See, in other Halo games, your vehicle would sorta reduce the amount of damage you took as you piloted them, obviously. Warthogs and Ghosts had open cockpits, so you were still pretty susceptible to getting shot, but being in a tank actually felt like being inside of a tank. The damage from base weapons were basically non-existent, and only power weapons or other vehicles could get the job done. That was not the case the first time around. I could be going insane, but it really feels like you're just as vulnerable in a vehicle as you are out on the field. This makes using slower vehicles like the Scorpion an absolute chore. And about the Scorpion, Jesus fuck, I legitimately cannot think of a worse vehicle in this entire franchise. Hell, the goddamn Mongoose from Reach had more of a purpose than this literal Matchbox toy. I've already mentioned its horrible accuracy, but combined with its vulnerability and the fact that it controls so painfully slow even for a tank, makes this entire vehicle just straight up not worth using. Hell, you have a much less frustrating time just running around on your feet, not even using the vehicles at all. Hell, I played the game like that and it was much more fun. And I haven't even mentioned that pea shooter excuse of a machine gun. It's even more egregious to use in multiplayer when everyone has a magnum and they can just easily pop your head in like 5 shots. And speaking of multiplayer, this is actually the first video game I've reviewed that features multiplayer, so yeah, that's pretty fancy and shit. Despite being one of the first, if not the first game to have 16-player lobbies, the game's multiplayer has held up extremely well. Sure, the map design can be a little sometimes. The big team battle maps are way too big, for instance, but other than that, Combat Evolved's multiplayer still offers a good time as long as you're not getting spawn killed. And speaking of which, the spawn system has drawn many complaints from Halo fans recently. Lots of players used to complain that the game just spawns you in completely random places with no rhyme or reason. That statement really couldn't be any farther from the truth. Hell, I'd even argue that Combat Evolved has a really damn good spawn AI. Unlike the other Halo games where there's already a list of assigned spawn points, Halo CE spawns dependent on the location of your teammates. It's a neat little system that adds a lot of depth to the gameplay as you can easily use it to your advantage. Granted, I did complain about this system in the past, but that was before I played a little bit of 2v2, and I truly noticed how strong this formula really was. The spawns are a little jank on anything 4v4 and higher, but on 2v2 modes is where the system shines. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that the Master Chief Collection kinda ruined the perception of this game spawning, because it's so obvious that this game wasn't designed to handle 4v4 matches since, well, unless it connected extra consoles, it was impossible to play a 4v4. I don't think that this new wave of Halo fans quite understand that online multiplayer literally didn't exist when Combat Evolved came out, so any match that wasn't a LAN party were 2v2s. But enough about all that, I think it's time that I wrap up this gameplay segment. Overall, the game is an oldie but a goldie. The enemy AI is super responsive, unpredictable, and forces you to play strategically. The sandbox is fantastic, the vehicles and most of the level design is poopy hot baloney garbage, and the multiplayer is really fun and really misunderstood by modern Halo fans. It's just amazing how well this game has held up after 2 entire decades and 3 generations of consoles. It really is one of those rare examples of an old school video game truly standing the test of time and still being just as fun as it was all those years ago. Occasional jank aside, I think any shooter fan, boomer shooter old head, or COD-loving newbies alike could find something to truly appreciate about this game. On top of the revolutionary gameplay, Halo also introduced another element that has since become a staple in first-person shooters as well: the way it told a narrative. Besides maybe Half-Life, shooters at the time were mostly about some angry old man going around fucking shit up, with some occasional text popping up to describe why he's fucking shit up. And then there was Halo, which took a more cinematic approach to its storytelling. Bungie really succeeded in making this game's story feel like a movie almost. Not quite at the level of Metal Gear Solid or the aforementioned Half-Life, but they still did a damn good job considering the technology that was present at the time. The story itself is fairly simple compared to what the rest of the franchise offers, but what really sells this story for me is a spectacle. It's one of those stories whose focus is primarily on set pieces and individual moments that constantly keep the player's attention. I could go on and on about how hype this game's ending is. I mean, you literally enable an actual time bomb, hop on a warthog, and try to escape as everything around you falls apart in explosions and absolute chaos. Now that is a fucking ending. What if I told you that wasn't my favorite moment in the game? No, that merit is actually awarded to the flood reveal scene. God, that mission as a whole is so fucking perfect in the way it builds up this haunting level of ambiguity. The build up and impact of the flood's first appearance is just so brilliantly executed and makes for one of the greatest moments in the entire franchise. Think about it. You're running through this dark and eerie jungle with no Cortana telling you where to go or what's up ahead. You're constantly coming across random bloodstains spread out all over the place, a mentally deranged ally rambling on about some sort of enemy that isn't the Covenant, and best of all, you discover the corpse of a Marine soldier, who just so happens to have some recorded footage lying around which depicts everything him and his squad went through and how they were all wiped out. Tensions are rising as you watch the footage. Said tension only increases as you watch Jenkins and his men get annihilated by an enemy. There has to be something other than the enemies you've been fighting throughout the game. By this point, if you haven't felt the slightest bit of unease, then, well, the actual reveal of the Flood might do you in. Man, just everything about this mission is absolutely perfect from a narrative perspective. It's constantly building more and more tension, and everything is paced beautifully. But despite all that, I still think the plot is rather thin. The characters aren't anything too exciting either, another issue I had with the story. While there are some really hype moments and mysteries surrounding the Haloran and the Flood, the characterization simply wasn't there yet. Neither was the deep writing that the series became known for. A couple of one-liners and those cool aforementioned moments here and there, but for the most part the dialogue and plot is mostly just, hey Chief, here's your objective, now go get to it. As cool as some of the individual story moments are, there isn't enough strength in the writing to get me truly invested in the characters and their motivations. Good thing this all changed with the sequel, where we got a much stronger plot, better written characters, and Master Chief having better voice direction. And about that last part, I think Master Chief sounded kinda goofy in this game. Although I guess it's not surprising when you consider the fact that Steve Downes was an inexperienced voice actor at the time. At the end of the day, Halo Combat Evolved has some of the best moments in the entire franchise, such as the arrival on Installation 4, and uncovering its purpose, the introduction of the Flood, and of course, who could forget about the Warthog run. But aside of that, the story is pretty bare bones and it really doesn't offer a whole lot. It's a cool story with plenty of memorable set pieces, sure, but it's still too much of a basic and linear story with blank slates as characters. Now, here lies the question. Do I talk about the anniversary graphics, or do I just discuss the originals? Because, well, judging by my footage, I only use the classic visuals. Oh well, I guess I feel obliged to criticize the anniversary's graphics, but I'm not gonna let it influence my overall score. And with that being said, they fucking suck. Bad lighting, overall detailed textures, and complete misunderstanding of what made the OG's art style so memorable. With that being said, I think the graphics of the real Combat Evolved hold up quite nicely. It does show its age in certain areas, but for the most part, the graphics combine some technical wizardry with the fantastic art style I mentioned earlier. One that I'm glad is being replicated successfully in Infinite. Gotta love the fog effect on some of these environments too. The atmosphere that this game builds up is just super gorgeous. Too bad most of this game is just spent looking at the same boring and repetitive infrastructure. Halo is among one of those franchises that is often held in the highest regard when it comes to their music, and man oh man is it easy to see why. If you thought this game's story felt cinematic enough, well, the OST takes that vibe and enhances it even further. Simply put, this soundtrack is purely epic, beautifully orchestrated, and even soothing at times. The composers very brilliantly capture the intensity of every battle, the eeriness of the Flood, the beauty of the game's environments, and best of all, the spectacle of some of its adrenaline-pumping set pieces. With every little part, crevice, and orifice in this game, there's a gorgeous piece of music to go along with it, and the amount of variety is pretty great too. You get your cinematic orchestra with incredibly epic arrangements involving violins, horns, percussion, and even some choir vocals, your atmospheric ambient music that provides some rather calming soundscapes, and you even get to hear a face-melting guitar solo during the final leg of the Sonic Cartographer. It's stuff like this that really gives this game a cinematic feel. It legitimately does make me feel like I'm sitting through a high-budget piece of well-crafted cinema. Yeah, I really can't come up with anything I dislike about this game's soundtrack, other than the fact that, get this, its sequel does everything so much better. Yeah, the soundtrack is basically perfect through and through. There is a pretty solid amount of content here, but a majority of it is all multiplayer stuff, as the campaign is relatively brief. And considering the time period, this game offered a pretty impressive amount of multiplayer content. So many different game modes that can be played across a variety of maps under 3 different game modes. If there was one thing about Halo that was truly revolutionary, it was the multiplayer. The Xbox wouldn't have online multiplayer until the following year, so if you wanted to play with more than just 4 people, you had to connect a bunch of consoles together and host a LAN party. I was just a dumbass infant back then, so I can't really describe the experience, but I can only imagine how memorable Saturday night LAN big team battles would be. But anyway, this game features a ton of content, even as if it's mostly just multiplayer. The campaign is pretty short, yeah, but there's enough variety with the multiplayer to keep you busy for a while, especially if you have the Master Chief Collection. In terms of things such as frame rate, clipping, and general glitches, this game is pretty stable. Frame rate's a smooth 60 on the MCC, no drops to speak of, and I'm yet to encounter any sort of glitch. However, in terms of some things being absolutely broken, Halo CE has that in spades. For instance, we already know about the nuclear frag grenades and how laughably unbalanced the Magnum is, but the thing that really gets me about this game is how the slightest tippy-tap from any vehicle will kill you. Yes, there are some instances where I got off a ghost, and the vehicle in question just so happened to, slide downward a bit, and I died. Add in the slippery vehicle physics and the fact they're completely indestructible in multiplayer. Yeah, I think the vehicle, among a few other things, should have been left in the oven for just a tad bit more. Again, the game runs extremely well and is practically glitch-free, but there are a couple mechanics and such that could have used a bit more polish that would have eliminated some needless frustration. While it doesn't offer one of the best campaigns in the franchise, Halo Combat Evolved is still solid enough to warrant a few extra playthroughs. The linear copy and paste level design is a pretty big detriment, but things like the sandbox and the brilliant enemy design should be enough to have you coming back for more. While there are certain aspects that haven't aged the best, Halo Combat Evolved still overall manages to stand the test of time. It can still deliver a memorable experience even to a first-time player. When it first launched 20 years ago, it served as a huge step in the right direction for not only shooters, but console gaming as a whole. And even after all this time, its influence can still be seen aplenty. Love this game or not, you have to give at least some credit, just for the sheer amount of influence it had on the industry. Along with Metal Gear Solid 2 and Devil May Cry, Halo Combat Evolved is among the games for that year that made a big change in the world of gaming. Like, where would story-driven games be today without Metal Gear Solid 2? Where would character action games be without Devil May Cry? And where would multiplayer console shooters be without Halo? Holy fucking shit, how the hell is this game 20 years old?
I have the index. You can just float and sputter.